A stereotype as defined by the Oxford Dictionary is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular person or thing. A bias is an inclination or prejudice for or against one person or group, especially in a way considered to be unfair. Most of us have most likely grown up hearing a good number of stereotypes, especially about groups that we don't identify ourselves with or that we consider other. As humans, we often learn about this world through generalizations that, as we mature and begin to navigate the world, should come into question. Thus, when we hear the stereotype that white people are smart, it's not an idea that we should take for granted. When we begin to look at the history of race and intelligence, what formed this idea in the first place? In the late 19th and early 20th century, proponents of social Darwinism took Darwin's law of natural selection and applied them in the context of humans and society. They had the belief that strict rules of biological evolution also apply to humans, with Herbert Spencer coining the term survival of the fittest. Eventually, this led Francis Galton to publish Hereditary Genius in 1869 and propose eugenics as a study of method of improving the innate quality of the human race, especially by selective breeding. Galton's goal was to ensure racial purity with a large emphasis on intelligence and mental ability. By the early 20th century, psychometrics and intelligence tests were being used to support these ideas with supposed scientific evidence. In 1994, Charles Murray published The Bell Curve that carried on with this proposition, again arguing the differences in intelligence are innate because of the racial differences reported in IQ scores. Given the long-standing history of these stereotypes, in 1995, social psychologists Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson published Stereotype Threat and Intellectual Test Performance of African Americans. Stereotype Threat established that whenever African American students perform an explicitly scholastic or intellectual task, they face the threat of confirming or being judged by a negative societal stereotype, a suspicion about their group's intellectual ability and competence. Thus, the hypothesis being tested was whether priming prior to testing interfered with their performance.
You know, I often say that people experience stereotype threat several times a day. And the reason is that we have a lot of identities. Our gender, our race, our age. And about each one of those identities that I mentioned, there are negative stereotypes. And when people are in a situation for which a negative stereotype about one of their identities is relevant to the situation, relevant to what they're doing, they know they could be possibly judged or treated in terms of that stereotype. They don't know whether they are or not, but they know they could be. And if the situation is important, that prospect starts to threaten them and upset them and distract them and can affect performance right there in the situation. And so you can find yourself kind of adjusting and deflecting, doing things that would deflect being seen by the stereotype. And it can affect their willingness or their interest in staying in that area of life where that kind of stereotype is relevant.
Experiments showing the stereotype threat effect have been repeated over 300 times since the original study. Variations have looked at stereotypes surrounding gender as well as race, and mostly focusing on high-stakes tests and correlations to achievement gaps.
There are no exceptions for stereotypes. Being that humans belong to so many categories such as age, sex, or even color, everyone is vulnerable to stereotypes. By normalizing stereotypes, people are more prone to be discriminated and labeled. These labels create false conclusions about individuals, which in turn generates bias and discrimination. We live in a society where we have expectations of people based on how they look. All these stereotypes have been embedded in our society for years and still persist. As you can see, not all stereotypes seem to be negative. Like for example, all Asians are smart. You might ask then, why someone would get upset by calling them smart. However, the truth is that just by assuming someone has certain characteristics, this causes false accusations that may make them more vulnerable to discrimination.
From now on, I too will be abstinent. I'll be as untouched as the turn signal in an Asian woman's car.
How much signal I need to cut across 8 lanes? None? I turn now. Good luck, everybody else!
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us.
As we can see in the videos, even the President of the United States incorporates stereotypes that make us realize how embedded they are in our society and the impact that it has on decision makers. The cartoon video presenting the stereotype of Asian women not knowing how to drive demonstrates how the media reinforces stereotypes, which indirectly influences people's perspectives. Stereotypes should not be normalized. It takes a toll on everyone's well-being, regardless of it being a positive or a negative stereotype. Finally, to prove stereotypes are not accurate, here are some examples of people breaking the barriers of stereotypes and proving that a book should not be judged by its cover, but by its content.
Stereotype threat refers to the risk one faces in confirming negative stereotypes about his or her racial, ethnic, gender, or cultural group. If negative stereotypes are present in regards to a specific group members become anxious about their performance. This may hinder their ability to perform at their maximum level. The individual does not need to believe that the stereotype is true for the effect to be present. It is hypothesized that anxiety that is induced by the activation of the stereotype threat decreases performance by depleting working memory. Stereotype threat has been shown to disrupt working memory and executive function, increase arousal, increase self-consciousness about one's performance, and cause individuals to try to suppress negative thoughts as well as negative emotions. One study found African American participants to have increased arterial blood pressure under stereotype threat, while another study saw increased cardiovascular activation amongst women when watching a video about stereotype threat as well as increased heart rate. Research into the neural basis of prejudice and stereotyping has frequently focused on the amygdala. The amygdala receives direct input from all sensory organs, enabling it to respond immediately before higher-up cognitive processes do. It plays an important role in arousal, attentiveness, and triggering the flight or fight response. Unconscious bias, then, is the immediate reflexive defensive reaction. Stereotyping, on the other hand, represents the cognitive component of social bias because it is the deliberate conceptual linking of social groups to a particular set of qualities. As such, it employs a different neural network from that of the snap judgments of prejudice. It is hypothesized that we have two systems of thinking, one that is fast and intuitive, System 1, and one that is slow and systematic, System 2. System 1 is automatic and efficient, but it is prone to mistakes. It seeks to quickly identify patterns, while System 2 seeks to test concepts and detect complexity. Cortisol is a steroid hormone that is produced by the adrenal glands, which sit on top of each kidney. When released into the bloodstream, cortisol can act on many different parts of the body and can help your body respond to stress. Cortisol production by the adrenal glands is regulated by the pituitary glands. Your pituitary gland reacts and sends a signal to the adrenal glands to produce just the right quantity of cortisol. In situations where a person feels anxious about conforming to a negative stereotype, there is an increased production of cortisol and neuroendocrine stress responses. The anterior cingulate cortex is the frontal part of the cingulate cortex and plays a role in a wide variety of autonomic functions, like regulating blood pressure and heart rate. However, it is also involved in higher-level functions like attention allocation, reward anticipation, decision-making, ethics and morality, impulse control, and emotion. The ACC can be divided anatomically into the cognitive, or dorsal, and emotional, or ventral components. The ventral part of the ACC is connected with the amygdala, nucleus accumbens, hypothalamus, hippocampus, and anterior insula, and is involved in assessing the salience of emotion and motivational information. The VACC seems to be especially involved when effort is needed to carry out a task, such as in early learning and problem solving. As shown in the image, one research study saw heightened activation of the ventral stream in the ACC when women experienced stereotype threat during a math test by using fMRI scans. The most prominent indicator that a person is undergoing stereotype threat is the increased physiological stress response due to increased arousal, negative cognitions that consume executive control, and self-regulatory changes in managing thoughts and emotions. In the research paper by Dirks, a comprehensive model for how stereotype threat occurs is outlined. It is thought to be produced by 3 distinct but related pathways. It places executive control as the proximal mediator and involves 3 different responses: physiological stress, performance monitoring, and affect regulation. To explain how this model works, when faced with the possibility of confirming stereotype threat about one's social identity, the person may be anxious or stressed and monitor their performance. They may suppress these emotions so as not to admit defeat. All of this taxes one's limited executive control strength, which are the same cognitive resources needed for proper performance of the task, and thus this is what creates an intellectual deficit. Women in the control condition showed increased recruitment of neural regions that have been associated with math learning, including the inferior prefrontal cortex, left inferior parietal cortex, and bilateral angular gyrus. However, women who had been reminded of their group's supposed math inferiority did not show enhanced activation in these useful brain regions, but instead in their ventral anterior cingulate cortex, an area associated with emotional self-regulation and the processing of affective information and social feedback. This suggests that stereotype threat disturbs intellectual capacity in two ways. One, by disrupting normal recruitment of cognitive areas normally needed for the task at hand, and two, by increasing recruitment of areas associated with emotional processing and regulation. How can we help decrease or negate the effects of stereotype threat? There are many different ways to combat this. Firstly, making people aware of stereotype threats helps decrease the negative effects. In one study, it was found that by teaching college women about stereotype threat and its effects on performance, it was sufficient to eliminate the predicted gender gap on a difficult math test. Secondly, by convincing people that stereotype threats are largely due to a self-fulfilling prophecy, this can be overcome through effort. People who believe that their performance is affected by hard work rather than genetics or biology tend to perform better because they believe in their own efficacy. We can also convince people that they have social belonging by increasing diversity and representation of minority groups and having people of different backgrounds interact. Another study found that by intentionally being around those who you normally don't consider part of your in-group, this helps mitigate racial bias. Lastly, by teaching people how to mitigate and evaluate their own stress and anxiety, the negative physiological responses of stereotype threat can be reduced. We must realize that stereotype threat is possible largely due to our own self-affirmation and can be overcome by believing in our own abilities.